This is about, I call it restoring the abused, looking for hope. This is going to be about those who have experienced sexual sin violation. They've been molested, raped, or some other type of sexual sin perpetrated against them. And it's a sensitive subject for sure. And so it's sensitive because the statistics are sobering. 1 in 4 women will report having experienced a sexual violation in their lifetime. And we believe that the statistics are actually a lot more than that, because more likely 1 in 2, because of the failure to report, the reluctance to come forward and let someone know. I counseled and am still counseling a young lady her sister's husband, she woke up in her parents' home to her sister's husband violating her while she was sleeping. And this is not an uncommon story concerning the reaction of her family, is why I'm telling you this story. So she told her parents and her sister, which was an act of bravery all in and of itself. And her father's response was, "We can't let anybody find out about this, or we're going to have to move in the middle of the night to a town where no one knows us." Devastating, absolutely devastating for her. But also devastating for her parents. They weren't prepared for something like this, and they didn't know what to do. I try not to be too hard on her mom and dad, in that this is a shocking revelation to them. Not something that I don't think anybody can actually be prepared for a disclosure like that. And their reaction is certainly not uncommon, if you will, because of a lot of the shame that's attached to a violation like this. And unfortunately, in this particular situation, her folks were very reluctant to come and meet with me, but her and her boyfriend came and met with me, who is now her husband, because she recognized if she didn't get the help she needed, that her relationship with her boyfriend was most likely going to be a really tough one for them. So good for her and him, because he has come and joined and as well. But what a devastating response. We can't tell anybody, or we're going to have to move in the middle of the night to a town where nobody knows us. So as we go to the first slide, the middle slide on the first page, where to begin, I've arranged this presentation not as a formulaic approach to how to help somebody who's been sexually violated or abused, but rather looking at what goes on the inside of someone that has been violated, knowing what that struggle looks like and how to try to help. And some statistical stuff about what is it, what kinds of families it occurs in, and some of the peripheral things involved as well. But where to begin? Dr. Diane Landberg is one of the top experts in this field, and she writes, "To fail to speak is awful, but to speak is equally awful, because the telling makes the story real. And the goal is to help the person learn to tell the story of God entering their life to restore it to a full, abundant one." And that is the story for any kind of redemption, but especially in this particular arena. And so we want to also answer the question, what is sexual abuse? It occurs whenever a person, child or adult, is sexually exploited by an older or more powerful person for the satisfaction of that abuser's needs. It can include verbal, visual, physical. Some of the effects on the person. They become depressed. Their memory is complicated or confused. They have difficulty trusting. Often they have severe anxiety symptoms that can result in GI problems. Substance abuse is fairly rampant against those who have been violated. Dissociation. To dissociate means to disconnect, to unplug. In other words, I hear it very often, I just want to be numb. I don't want to feel anything. That's to dissociate. Nightmares, anxiety with flashbacks, self-injury, cutting, self-mutilation is a very common behavior. And then these are, for the person violated, these are rational responses to sex abuse. That may sound a little confusing or absurd, but they are in so much pain and devastatingly lost that their identity has been destroyed, and that these are, in their mind, rational responses to that pain and to that confusion. Certainly very self-destructive, but it makes sense to them. I counseled a 38-year-old woman a number of years ago. She came to me and she had alluded to why she wanted to make the appointment, but this was her opening statement to me. I was abused as a little girl by my grandfather at the age of 8, and I've never dealt with it. I'm 37 years old. I lost one marriage to it already, and I'm about to lose my second. And I drink constantly to not deal with it. At 37, she had finally decided to face the nightmare of what had happened to her. And I report wonderfully, we worked together for about a year, and she said to me, I think I'm good. I think I'm good to go. Thank you for all your help. And I went, okay, bless you, and thanks for the privilege of helping you. About 3 months later, she called me up. She goes, yeah, I need to come back. I'm not good. I need to do some further work. And she came back for about another 6 months, and then she said, okay, I'm good now. I really am good. And I've never heard from her again. And it's just one of those stories that keeps me doing what I do. I wish they all turned out like that, but they don't. My point is, she had not dealt with it for her whole life since it had happened to her. And it was a very courageous step, one in which God was intimately involved and led her to contact me. And it turned out wonderful. The average age of the person being sexually violated in this country is the age of 8. So that's fairly young. And that in and of itself is devastating. Families in where the abuse occurs, there is no such thing as a typical or normal family where abuse occurs. But there are some similar identifiable behaviors or symptoms. Often have multiple problems, so they're a very dysfunctional family. They're often very rigid in their relational roles, so there's not a lot of I would say they're very what we in this particular business call a closed family system, in which they're very protective of their family. They don't share a lot about their family with others. Not a lot of relationships with others, even if they are a church-going family. They're very secretive. They try to keep everything in-house. They don't like people to know their business or what's going on, what their struggles are as a family or as a married couple. What we call a closed family system. And that means there's not a lot of feedback, not a lot of, they're not very teachable, not very open to getting outside of their own little echo chamber, so to speak. They are confused about individual roles, so we have role confusion, and they send destructive messages, very negative, very pessimistic, fatalistic type families or marriages. It sounds horrible, doesn't it? Not a lot of hope, not a lot of happy, not a lot of, and therefore, the sexual behavior becomes a way in which you feel something good and fun, if that makes sense. Because it's, let's be honest, sex feels good, and arousal is normal, and it's a way to feel something other than the negative, depressive family system. I can tell you, I got a call one time from a Christian family. For about 10 years, I worked in what is called the therapeutic boarding school environment. They're ranches for kids, if you're familiar with that, where parents will send their kids to a program, and it's a residential, and the kids will come for a year to a year and a half. Normally, they work through levels that they progress towards graduation. They go to school there. They go to counseling there. They're in groups. And they have chores and responsibilities around the facility, and then they also live in a dorm situation. And I worked in 3 different boarding school programs, clinical director of all 3. And first one was co-ed, second one was all female, third was all male. The co-ed one presented its problems of its own, of course. But when I was working at that particular program, all were Christian based, all were in a biblical context of addressing rebellion to authority, defiance, disrespect towards their parents and authority. Got a phone call one time from a mom, and I'm like, "Hi, thank you for calling. Jeffrey Scoggin, Clinical Director of Program. How can I help you? What kind of music do you let the kids listen to there?" And I went, "What's your name, please?" And she went on to explain that they were a homeschool family. Now, my wife and I homeschool all of our kids, so I'm not knocking homeschool families, I'm just telling the story. We're a homeschool family, and we have 4 children. We go to church every Sunday, Wednesday night, but our kids are not allowed to go to Sunday school. We don't want them in youth group. And, we just kind of stick together as a family. And they were very rigid and strict about the kind of music they let their kids listen to, the kind of TV, movies, books they let their kids read and watch. It was extremely strict, rigid, and very narrow. In my opinion, narrow-minded. But what had happened is their teenage son had violated their younger daughter, which makes sense to me. I'm like, you completely shut him off from the rest of the world, and the only person or the only access that he has to trying to figure out this thing called puberty and sexuality is his sister. I'm not saying it's right, of course it's not, but it made sense because his parents were also somewhat unapproachable to talk about this thing called sexuality or puberty or mom, what am I feeling and why, and it's confusing and I want to understand it. So he had gotten in trouble with the legal system, and they were needing to place him, and they were looking for a Christian program in order to get him help. After she got through talking to me, little self-disclosure, I'm a metalhead. I love heavy metal. I have since before I was a believer. So when I answered her question, we weren't going to get that admission. I already knew we weren't going to get it anyways. But we definitely weren't going to get it after I told her, well, I listened to the heavy metal with the kids, actually. Anyways. The stages of sexual abuse. The development of intimacy and secrecy. We call this grooming in my profession, where the offender is isolating his intended victim to gain their trust to the end goal of completing his lustful desires. So he develops intimacy and secrecy with his potential victim. There's physical contact that appears appropriate. Again, I'm trying to be respectful and sensitive. I'm not trying to gross anybody out, but I just want to have a very transparent talk with you in that I was involved in a case where a sister had invited her brother to come and live with them. He was having hard times, down on his luck. Sis says, yeah, come live with us until you can get on your feet. We'll help you out. And he took a liking to his niece and was literally molesting her as the mom sat 6 feet away from them by sitting the little girl on his lap, on top of his hand, and I'll let you figure out the rest. The mom was 6 feet away. The little girl was on his lap, and he was playing uncle, and everything seemed legitimate, appropriate, and above board, but it was anything but. The tragedy of abuse is that the enjoyment of one's body becomes the basis for the hatred of one's soul. Dan Allender is another expert that I highly recommend. He wrote the book, The Wounded Heart, and he's got very good insight, and he works also to help victims of sexual violation recover. And because abuse happens to the body and with the body, a lot of victims really struggle with their body, and they hate it because if they didn't have a body, this wouldn't have happened to me. And that's what he was referring to, the hatred of one's soul. I've actually worked with women who have intentionally gained weight to become unattractive so that they could feel safe, so that no man would be attracted to them because they didn't feel safe in their own body and they didn't want to be attractive. Of course, in our day and age, more recently, I'm working with a family currently whose daughter has chosen to change her gender and become a male because she does not want to be female anymore. She feels that being male makes her more safe and that she won't get hurt again. And that's her answer to changing her body so that she is no longer a target. And the parents, of course, are struggling to figure out how to relate to her, much less talk with her about what she's intending. They maintain abuse and secrecy via threats and privileges. It's not an uncommon behavior for manipulation in the form of threats or of bribery to be used in order to gain the trust and or keep the secrecy of the violation. Anywhere from I'll kill your mom and dad if you tell, to I'll kill your pet, your dog, your brother, your sister, I'll kill everybody you know, or something along the lines of, if you tell, I'm going to go to prison. Or if you tell about our little secret, you're going to get in trouble. They're going to know what you've done. And they're going to think you're a bad, bad girl. Very wicked, evil stuff to be used to keep secrecy and silence. The resentment of stage 1 privileges and the increases of violation. And so this is talking about the maintaining of that secrecy. and the prolonging of the victim's silence. It's just evil stuff. This is what some of the lies that they experience and feel living in an abused body. You are only a body and nothing else. Your body is the enemy. Your body is worthless trash. If I had a dime for every time I heard a violation victim tell me that I feel worthless, I could retire. It's a joke, obviously, but I'm just telling you, this is one of the most common comments that I hear, is that I feel worthless. I have no value, I have no worth. I am trash. And they absolutely feel this way about themselves. And again, your gender is the problem. This is a relatively new one. Not new, but the approach, like I talked about earlier, to solve this lie is a new approach. This fourth lie has been believed and used for decades now. Your gender is the problem. And it's simply not true. There are male sex abuse victims as well. Yes, they are a smaller percentage and in the minority, actually about 8%. That leaves about 92% of victims female. So it is very prevalent as far as who this is happening to. And those stats haven't changed all that much over the last about 20 years. But here's the truth that they need to embrace, hear, and embody. And as God made your body and said it was good, God chose to live in a body. He lives in your body, and God is willing to live in your body. He voluntarily and intentionally resides there. And those are things that they really struggle to understand and embrace because of the hatred of their body and what it means to them. So the search for peace, first of all, safe and honest, helping them to understand that true hope never minimizes a problem in order to make it more palatable and easily managed. When we fail to trust the real God, we do not escape trusting someone or something. Trust, like breathing, and indeed like worship, is inevitable. Again, I'm going to do a lot of quoting from Dan and Diane. I find them to be very insightful and just very helpful. And David Paulison is part of the CCEF that I referenced yesterday to a couple of my talks. CCEF, Christian Counseling Education Foundation. He also wrote a book, Recovering from Child Abuse. Abuse feels like an experience that has stamped you and has the final word on your identity. But the truth is, God gives you a different identity. The abuse you suffered is part of the stage upon which your life choices will now take place. You are marked by suffering, but that suffering has become your context for knowing God. Now, I can't unpack that statement per se, but I recently had a mom. Her adult son. He was medically discharged from the Marine Corps. He got injured, couldn't recover. He dreamed of being a Marine his whole life, finally realized it, then the dream got crushed, unfortunately. That was a pretty difficult thing to deal with, but when he moved back to the Valley, he told his mom, "I need to go silent." And she was like, "What?" She goes, "I need to go silent. I can't talk to you. I can't have contact or communication with you." And she thought it was due to the injury that occurred in the Marine Corps. Well, she's sitting in her house one Saturday afternoon, and her son pulls up in his vehicle, And she hasn't talked to him in over a year, and she's ecstatic to see him. She is so happy. And he gets out, and they hug. He allowed her to hug her. But she could tell something was clearly wrong, and she's like, honey, what is it? Tell me, what's wrong? He says, when I was 8, Grandpa molested me multiple times. Did you know? And she said, I had no idea. What are you telling me? It was her dad. What? And she was devastated. I've only been working with her for about 6 weeks. This is just brand new. She had no clue. And her father's deceased. He's been deceased now about 6 years. And so this lady sits in my office and asks me the question, why didn't God protect my son? I didn't like that session. There's no easy answer that she's going to like. Right? That's a tough one. I answered it. I don't have time to go into how I did that, but to the victim and even to their loved ones, suffering now is your story, and it is for how you're going to know God. That's not a very popular answer, but let's be honest. That's the answer for all of us who have been saved from sin and are currently being redeemed from it on a daily basis, right? This is a particular kind of evil. And the violated person really struggles to understand why God let this happen to me. And you've got to gently walk them through that and help them to understand. And it's difficult. I wished I could sit here and report to you that I've had more successes than failures, but I can't. I've had a lot of successes, and I'm very thankful for them. But I say failure, it's just, that's not exactly what I mean, but their failure to embrace and move forward with this idea of now suffering and understanding how God is going to use it in their life. They often bail on the process of counseling before I can get them to that point. And it's just a symptom of the pain and that they're not ready yet. And I just pray that God gets them ready at some point. The search for peace, grieving a lost child, we need to help them learn that something was definitely robbed from them, stolen. A great many coping mechanisms are destructive. The cycle is very similar to the abuse cycle. You feel it hurts. You find some way to disconnect. A large part of helping the client understand what it means to be a victim is educating the client about what it means to be a child. And the application that Diane gives here is watch children the age that you were abused. Go and observe them. Go and hang around children at the age in which you were abused and try to gain some kind of insight. One of the exercises that I often have abused adults do is to write a letter to their little self, is what I call it. But you're a big person now. You're an adult, and I say, go ahead and write a letter to your 8-year-old self, and talk to that child. And it's very therapeutic, and I have extremely good results with how they connect with, empathizing with their younger self, if you will. How they tell that child, I'm so sorry this happened to you. And they go through the whole process of just reassuring that child that that they understand and that they are gonna do something to heal from it. So that is reading those letters oftentimes is just mind-blowing and amazing. And it gets a lot of positive results. The enemy of shame. Shame is an experience of the eyes. Legitimate shame exposes depravity, and illegitimate shame shines a light on some element of dignity. A godly response in the face of abuse is to grieve for the perpetrator's sin and for the damage done to our soul. But the natural response is to cower in shame, condemning our own soul for being so foolish as to hope, want, or risk. Shame intensifies the horror of the past. Shame is compounded by personal confusion. And this will be the biggest obstacle to overcome when helping someone to embrace God and embrace the redemption of learning to live in a body that's been abused and learning to forgive the one that abused you. That's a difficult one too. Oftentimes they feel like to forgive is to agree or to allow the person to get away with something. You got to walk them through what it really means to forgive, how to do that well. I mentioned to a victim a number of years ago, and it was after she'd been coming for a few months. You have to just be careful and time things. Sometimes you just kind of have to use your own discernment and your own intuitiveness and kind of know. And sometimes, quite frankly, it's a guessing game, trying to guess when's the strategic time to introduce some of this stuff. And I said to her, I said, at some point you're going to have to forgive the person that did this to you. I will never forgive him. Like, whew, not ready yet. Okay. But it was venomous and vehement. She absolutely was not going to do that. Again, in my transparency, she quit coming about a month later, and I grieved that, and I also questioned, okay, did I do something? And you can't do that too much, or you just drive yourself crazy. But it may have been that question that caused a lot of turmoil for her. Not that I was intending to do that. Clearly, I was trying to be helpful, and we all know that if you the old saying that if you harbor bitterness, it's like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And I was trying to help her become not bitter, and she just wasn't ready. And it stinks. But if you can't forgive, you won't heal. And that's a fact. Painless is not peace. When we abandon pain, in parentheses leprosy, we lose a sense of being intact and alive. Many times the chronic patterns of lying or deceit common to abused persons are because of forsaken history that forces them to concoct a past and a present that has no connection to their abused soul. To cut off the past is to erase part of our story, our journey, our self. In the beginning, honestly facing the characteristic lies and denial associated with sexual abuse usually intensifies the experience of the victim. So what this is saying is there's a lot of pain. And you've got to help them learn to navigate and face that pain in a productive way because they don't want to. What I constantly tell people, gently, but this is what I consistently and constantly say. This is a journey. It's a journey towards healing. Healing is possible. God can and will heal you. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this journey is fun, but I am going to tell you it's worth it. And I try to convince them as best as I can that this is going to be brutally not fun, but it is oh so worth it to get out the other side. And like I said earlier, a few of them make it, a lot of them don't. But I still feel like we've planted seeds, we've made some progress, we've introduced some truth and some ideas for them to have to wrestle with in their conscience and in their soul, and hopefully at some point in the future they'll deal with it. regaining your voice because of secrecy and silence, because of those threats, manipulation, and bribery that take place. Again, just real life stories here. I'm working with a mom right now whose son violated her daughter. He's 15, the daughter's 5. She's been married a couple different times, so they're half siblings, but you know, he bribed his little sister. I'll buy you this. He showed her a picture of this big bear that he took on his phone in one of the stores in town. And he says, I'm going to get you this bear. And that allowed him to do what he did. And then after it got disclosed, it all came out. He's actually currently placed in a program in Arkansas. It's a residential inpatient program for adolescent sex abusers. And the mom wept in session here a couple weeks ago. She said, Jeffrey, Gabby asked me this week, when am I going to get that bear? I want that bear. When am I going to get it? Wow. Mom's not going to buy the bear, by the way. There's an association there that mom's like, I ain't buying that bear. I want to kill that bear. It's powerful. So when we're regaining voice, we're working against you know, that secrecy, that bribing, that threatening that caused the silence in the first place. Abuse strips a person of the freedom to choose. To live with a dead soul makes deep sense to an abused victim. Love is not an absence of anger. In fact, an absence of anger makes love anemic and devoid of passion. And so a lot of the voice in the beginning is going to be angry, venomous. It's going to be some not nice things said about the offender, and even some not nice things said about themselves. But they need to have that voice. Like I said in the talks yesterday, if you were here, one of the things I teach interns that I train in order to become a counselor is that the counseling office is free of judgment. This is a safe and secure place where we love unconditionally. We do not judge or condemn. We eventually will confront, for sure. I mean, I can't do my job as a biblical counselor without presenting the whole gospel of God and using truth. But in the beginning, it's not the time or place. They need to purge their soul of the vile hatred and anger that they have towards what has happened to them. And yeah, I hear it on a regular basis. I'm angry at God. I'm angry at my family. I'm angry at my abuser. I'm angry at everybody. And I don't sit there and wag my finger like, you can't be angry at God. I just like, okay, be angry then. We'll deal with the doctrinal discrepancies later. We definitely will if I have that opportunity. But in the beginning is not the time. They need to be, it's okay to be angry about what happened to you. And you can do that in a safe place. That's totally fine. It's a step towards regaining that voice. And I have to teach them healthy boundaries. You know, when they finally start gaining the confidence to have a voice, to start standing up for themselves, to quit being a doormat, to quit letting people walk all over them, which are things that happen, to quit being timid, basically. I taught one person, this was a male victim, and they're, for me at least, they're pretty rare, and they are in the minority, but he had been sexually abused as a child, had horrible boundaries. I'm teaching him boundaries, and he was a developmentally disabled adult in a group home in our town, and the staff member called me up and said, "Did you tell so-and-so that he could get physical with some of the other housemates? And I'm like, no, what happened? She said, well, he said you taught him to stand up for himself. So that meant he grabbed one of his roommates by the shirt collar and backed him up against the wall and yelled at him, and it was something along the lines of, you can't tell me what to do. So what I said and what he heard, the wires got crossed. I'm like, I did not tell him to get aggressive. I didn't do that. And oftentimes for them, because they've been so timid and have allowed others to mistreat them or just to walk all over them, they don't know how to stand up for themselves. And you just have to kind of teach them and help them learn what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. That aggression isn't appropriate. I actually laughed because I could just picture him doing this. I didn't laugh because it was funny. I was just like, of course he would do that. In his limited ability to understand what a healthy boundary was, of course he would do that. I'm going to have to figure out how am I going to help him to get what I'm actually trying to help him get. A very tempting trap. The primary purpose in facing victimization is not simply to know how one feels about it, but to expose more clearly the victim's subtle patterns of seeking life and comfort apart from dependence upon God. True story, because of what has happened to them, and sometimes growing up in that secrecy and that silence. And I can't even tell you how many times I have sat in my office where, with a married couple, as I'm doing couples counseling, and the wife reveals to the husband that she had been sexually abused as a girl. And he's like, why didn't you say something to me when we were dating or engaged? And it's the secrecy and the silence and the fear, of course. If I did, you wouldn't want me. I'm trash. I have to keep this hidden from you because if you found this out about me, you'd dump me and go date somebody else. All of that. But I cannot tell you how many times I've heard somebody say to me, I learned a long time ago, I am the only one that I can trust to take care of me. I don't trust nobody. And you've got to help them get past that as well. Learning to trust again. It's a very difficult task because to trust others means I'm going to become vulnerable. I'm going to have to risk. Those people might hurt me. And I don't want to trust them. So, honesty about the form of all self-protection also helps the victim to see the small choices of life from a larger vantage point. And I'm referring to, helping them to depend on God, trust God. It's a distortion. It's a doctrinal discrepancy, clearly. Well, God didn't protect me when I was a kid. And that's a pretty tough one to navigate too, by the way. But it's doable. But just helping them to clear up. I keep calling them doctrinal discrepancies. One of the things that I do in my counseling practice, because I am a biblical counselor, I teach all my interns this, you better have good theology, because we're listening for false theology. That's what I'm listening for. I'm listening for bad theology, false theology. I'm listening for idols. I'm listening for false beliefs about God, about themselves, about relationships, about the Bible, about doctrine. I am intently listening for where they are in error so that I can correct them with the truth and set their feet upon a solid, firm foundation, and God will heal them. So, forgiveness. One reason this is hard to do, facing unhealthy or sinful coping mechanisms, is that your response to abuse usually seems so much less wrong than what happened to you. Your life is ruined, so you are bitter and unforgiving. Alternatives to forgiveness, bitterness, fear, holding a grudge, never trusting anybody, all seem reasonable responses. And I had a pastor that refers a lot to me from his congregation. And this is what he said to me. He goes, "You know why I refer to you?" I said, "Hopefully because you trust me and I'm trying to do the best job that I can do." And he goes, "Yeah, that too, but because you'll always come around to the topic of forgiveness. You're the only counselor that I know that's on your agenda. Every single person you meet with. It needs to be. We can't allow people to not forgive. That keeps them in bondage. And I want to set people free." And finally, last slide, the search for restoration, the role of relationships. Recovery, learning not to live based on the fear, must also occur in the context of relationships. It cannot occur in isolation. It is important to understand that you cannot figure out relationships by yourself. We learn about relationships in relationships. Learning to tell normal hurt from abnormal hurt is a difficult process. And that comes back to the trust thing, being vulnerable. They find it very difficult to understand what Diane is saying here, just normal relational conflict and difficulty from abusive, because to them anything that hurts is abusive, and it's not true. If you're married, or if you will be married at some point in the future, all relationships have conflict. And they're hard. It takes hard work. I appreciate what Christopher Yuan said last night. Marriage is work. Boy, is he right. It is a ton of work. Relationships are work, too. All relationships are work. It's not easy. And for the person who's been sexually violated, sometimes the work just isn't worth it, to be quite honest. It's too hard and too risky and too painful. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of what you're dealing with. And just know that as we're trying to help heal. 3 things that get damaged: voice, personhood, and relationships. Basically, we could boil everything I've said today down to those 3 things. That's what you're trying to help heal and help them to be set free to be able to do in a God-honoring and in a satisfying, abundant way. Regain their voice, restore their personhood, and help them have healthy relationships with themselves and their neighbor. That is it in a nutshell. I wished it were as easy as a nutshell, but it's not. It is extremely, I call it a journey, and because I think it is, but I mean, we're all on a pilgrimage, right? That old song, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." Am I dating myself at all? I was a youth pastor at Dry Creek Bible Church in Belgrade for 6 years. We sang that song every Wednesday night back in the 80s. Okay, I'm aging myself. And so I hope it was helpful, informative. I know it can be intimidating and daunting as well. Trust me, I've been doing this for 23 and a half years. One of the things I work very hard at is to not become intimidated by it or overwhelmed by it still. But one of my greatest joys, to be quite honest, is, and I hope this doesn't sound too arrogant, but God, I love it when we kick Satan's butt and we watch somebody heal. There's nothing better than watching somebody get free from the damage of evil. It is awesome. Worth striving to accomplish that every time.
Do you have time for questions?
I do. It's 11:22 and we have till 11:30.
Okay. You mentioned the sex change. I have a couple questions. I have a very good friend who is married to my husband's cousin. They had a daughter, they have a daughter, well, they had a daughter who was deaf, she was molested. She has had a sex change. I don't know how, the whole thing is so, I can't explain the word, but I still want to keep a good relationship with Frida and with the
The new person,
the
yeah.
new person. And what kind of advice can you give me?
Well, I think Christopher, you on last night, were you at his talk
Yes,
last
I
night?
was.
That, his advice is right on the money.
Yes.
You know, and look at the speaker from yesterday too. I was fascinated by what's his name again, Smith? Ken, yeah, sorry, I blanked out there. Just his approach. This is how I approach my counseling practice. You're loved here, there's no judgment. Just come and it's okay to be you. I said, I mean, I have people who calls themselves Christians who drop the F-bomb in my office, and I'm like, I don't really particularly like hearing that, but I don't scold them for it. I'm like, I do, if it becomes what's the word? If it becomes too much, I'm like, could you please not do that so much? I really don't like hearing it. But I don't scold them or tell them what they're doing is wrong in the process of healing. You know, I just love them. And eventually we get to confronting it. But it's not in the beginning. That's not the place for it yet. Like I said yesterday, one of the greatest privileges that I enjoy is when someone says to me, I'm about to tell you something I've never told another living soul. And I'm like, we are going to get to the good stuff now. Now we can do real work. I love hearing that. I've heard it hundreds of times. But I can tell you the story of a little gal. She was in the very first therapeutic boarding school, severely abused. I worked with her for 2 years. She took longer than most, but she had come from a severe case. About a year in, a little over a year in, her mom wanted to set up an appointment with a local psychologist, which I'm not a huge fan of that, but parents are the guardian. So it's my job to talk her into going to see this guy because I know she's not going to want to. And so I'm trying to talk her into it, tell her all the benefits of why. And she says to me, she goes, I'm not going to go talk to a complete stranger and open up to him. It took me over a year to trust you. And I went, it took over a year? I thought you were doing great. You talked my ear off half the time. She goes, oh yeah, I was just wasting time and telling you what I thought you wanted to hear because I didn't really want to open up and talk to you. I'm like, well, that hurts. I just loved her. I just loved her. And she eventually came to trust me. And I think that's what Ken Smith said. I think that's what Christopher is saying, and it's what I would say. You just love them as Jesus would love them. Have them over for dinner. Just become their friend. Don't. If the door gets opened to tell them the gospel, tell them the gospel. We are not responsible for saving anyone. We are just responsible to share the good news. God is the one that convicts the heart, draws them close to himself, and he's the one that's going to transform them. I get to help in the process. I literally love my job. I can't believe I get paid for this. I watch people transform in front of my eyes, and I'm thinking, God, you are so awesome, and I'm getting paid for this. You do the work, I get paid. This is great. I mean, I'm like one of the luckiest guys on the earth. Don't get me wrong, I work hard, and it's laborious work. But that's how I have to look at it. He does the work, I get paid for it. It's awesome. Yeah. Right. I say forgiveness is a process of letting go, of learning I describe it as the process of what I think is the biblical picture of forgiveness. We owed God a debt we could not pay. We are deep, deep in the red. And he says, I am going to forgive that debt. The debt is wiped clean. On the cross, the debt was paid in full. Jesus doesn't collect the debt owed to him. That person being violated, the violator now owes them a debt that they can never pay. Don't expect to collect something that's not payable. And forgiveness means that I let go of my right to claim what is mine. You owe me a legitimate debt. I want paid. You're not going to get paid. There's nothing that violator is going to pay you that is going to satisfy the debt. If it's appropriate, I go into the parable of the wicked servant. He comes before the king. The king forgives him this massive debt. He leaves the room and grabs one of his servant who owes him little and shakes him violently and says, pay what you owe. And he says, I can't, I don't have, I'm going to throw you in prison till you pay. And two little spies over in the corner are like, you see what he did? And they run back to the king and like, you know that guy that you just forgave and made your debt? Yeah, he shook the guy. And the king calls you back and says, you wicked servant, I forgave you much. That's not always palatable, but isn't that the picture of forgiveness? We have been forgiven much, thousands upon thousands of sins. And I don't say it in a trivial or trite way at all, but I try to help them to understand the biblical picture of forgiveness. It cost Jesus everything to forgive, because forgiveness is sacrificial. That's a tough pill for a victim of violation to swallow, but it's biblically accurate. Now you just have to find a way to get them to buy in. And you do it gently, and you do it lovingly, and with tons of prayer. Does that make sense?
Jeff, could you talk again about this letter? You said you asked people sometimes to write a letter to themselves at the age they were abused. Could you just touch on that again, the purpose of that letter, what you're looking for?
I'm looking for them to validate to their 8-year-old self or 6-year-old self that they are not at fault. It's not their fault this happened to them.
Just a quick question. I have a young friend in Washington State. She's 24. She attempted suicide about 4 months ago. She's been wrestling with gender fluidity and all this stuff. And she has begun hormones and is
Hormone therapy,
surgery.
yep.
And she was Theodore Ashcraft. We called her Teddy. Now she's Corey. I don't want to call her he or him. I don't want to call her Corey. I've always known her as Teddy. Do you respect what they're trying to do and call them by the gender they want to be?
I say yes, because you're not approving. To say Corey, it doesn't mean you're approving, because you're not. But it still keeps the relationship, the bridge, intact, and gives you an opportunity at some point
That's
to...
That's my fear of closing, because I find it very difficult to call her, to treat her, and I'm saying her now,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a man, because she is still a woman, and she was sexually abused, and she's just had a horrible, horrible life.
Yep. And she's searching for a solution
And I don't wanna
to be
slam
happy.
doors, right? I don't want to slam the doors, but I don't want to give the appearance of approving what she's doing.
Right, and you don't. And to cooperate with her isn't approval. And somehow you kind of have to say that in a way that can be palatable and acceptable, that doesn't come across as being a judgmental, hypocritical jerk.
Well, that wasn't the answer I wanted, but I accept that answer.
Yeah, it's this whole gender fluidity and gender Yeah, it's going to be difficult to navigate in the next few decades for sure. So,